All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Attorney Lounge. Today we have Niki Black. She is, if you're in the legal industry, you know who she is. She's a very well-recognized voice in the legal industry, in particular in legal tech. She's a lawyer, an author, a journalist, subject matter expert, you name it, and self-described. She bridges the gap between lawyers and emerging technology like Gen I and law firm software. She exists where law and technology intersect, which is not where I intersect. That's sort of a difficult thing for me. I intersect where lawyers hit lawyers, I think, more. So I'm learning more about tech, and that's hopefully what we're going to talk about today in addition to her career. So Niki, thank you for joining us.
Sure thing. We're looking forward to our conversation.
So I've kind of thrown a little bit of curveballs. They're not really curveballs, but I'm going to throw this out to you. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked another person that was on podcast that's kind of the same thing, lawyer, but involved in technology. And the question, this was posed by someone I follow on Twitter. His hot take was that people 5 years from now will trust their AI lawyer more than their real lawyer. Do you feel like that's true or not true?
I mean, it's a grand prediction. I think that it's really hard to tell right now. AI is advancing really rapidly, but it's hard to predict how it's going to impact the legal profession and to what extent it's going to replace lawyers, if at all. I think it's reasonable to say that some entry-level positions will be significantly impacted. I'm not sure that it's going to replace the function of lawyers anytime soon, certainly not in 5 years, but it's really hard to predict where it's going. So I can't say that person's wrong. I'm not sure I agree with that exactly, but.
Well, I mean, it's advancing pretty rapidly, and I know a lot of people are getting very comfortable with ChatGPT now, and I think it's sort of, highlighting for people kind of what the technology is capable of. It's just not there yet, but it is interesting to see, and we'll kind of get into that. I'm curious to get kind of your take on how that's going to impact the law. But I think first of all, just with kind of the structure of the show and the format here, I really want to sort of start by talking about you and your background and, kind of how you navigated to where you're at today. So if you wouldn't mind, just kind of share with us your background, where you grew up, kind of what you were interested in growing up, kind of who was Niki Black before you became an attorney.
Well, I grew up in upstate New York in Syracuse for most of my life. I moved here when I was 5. I was born in Dallas. And my mom married my dad when I was 7, the father that raised me. And he was a physician. And so were his brothers and my grandpa and my grandpa's brothers. And so I came from a family of physicians. And I knew that I did not want to be a physician. I really don't like math. I really don't like science. And some of my parents' friends, their closest friends, there were 2 lawyers. One was primarily a criminal defense lawyer, and the other was essentially became a PI med mal lawyer. And so those were what they did seemed a lot more interesting to me. And so they were sort of part of the reason I considered going to law school. I wrote well, and I think every kid will tell you their parents that they argued well. They went to law school, so I probably argued pretty well too. So I always kind of thought then I took some of those career tests, and they also would mention lawyer. So I think probably in early high school, I started to decide that I wanted to go to law school, and in high school, I interned. No, it was in college, I think. I think I followed one of those lawyers around, went to their office. And then I went to college and at the University of Rochester, which is one major city over from Syracuse. I actually went to Case Buster my freshman year, transferred to the U of R. And so ended up being a religion major, which means I studied the phenomenon of religion. I wasn't religious studies. And decided I wanted to stay in upstate New York. And when I was in school, I interned with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Syracuse. So I sort of got a sense of what that was like. I applied to all the upstate New York law schools and some in Boston. And I knew I wanted to stay here. And I knew that I had the really regional schools were going to keep you in upstate New York, not the national. I didn't want to go into a large firm. I also knew that. So I got into Boston College, but I got into all of the upstate New York schools with the exception of Cornell. So I picked the one that all Albany Law School that most of my parents' lawyer friends recommended. And that's where I went to law school. And then after law school, I moved to Rochester, interned in the public defender's office for a year because I graduated in 95, which was one of the big recessions, and nobody was leaving the office. Nobody was moving. So I interned for about a year in the appeals department and worked at Olive Garden part-time, waiting to get hired. And I finally got hired after a year. And so that was when, and then for about a decade, I practiced law
Okay.
in a
That's
bunch of
interesting.
capacities.
You hear about a bunch of people that go to Hollywood and they're like waiters and waitresses while they're trying to break into acting. I've never heard of somebody that waited tables trying to break into the legal industry. So that's the first.
And that was not fun. I was at the Olive Garden. And I remember one time one of the cooks was on parole and he yelled at me and said, "How are you going to represent people's lives if you can't get an order correct?" And he really made me ponder my life choices, but I turned out to be a much better lawyer than a waitress,
That's funny.
in my
Well, hey,
opinion.
you're one step better than me. When I was in college, I tried to get a job as a waiter and I interviewed at a place called Carlos O'Kelly's and they said, you'd be better in the kitchen. So I took that. I was a little insulted by that, but I, so yeah, I made Mexican food for about 3 months and I was like, I can't do this anymore. So
Yeah.
that was sort of a hard way to make a living. So when you broke in, you started at the public defender's office. Is that
Yeah.
right? What was that like? Like what is that? You were there what 4 or 5 years? Like what does that
4 years.
involve? Yeah.
Well, it was really interesting because the first year, like I said, I was writing appeals, and I actually won one of that. One of the most notable things I probably did with my legal career was that appeal that I won, which got a murder conviction overturned. So, like right out of the gate, it
Wow.
was hard to top that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. But then I started in town courts, and back then our caseloads were unbelievable. We had some of the highest caseloads, higher than New York City, even. So, I started in town court with a misdemeanor caseload of 600 cases, and they just threw you in feet first. Like there was
Wow.
minimal training and you just learned as you went. And when I was in city court, which was like the next stage after town courts, we would have, again, 600 cases, but you'd pick them all up over the span of a month. Whereas town courts, it was always like rolling. So you just always had 600, but they were at all different stages. But when you'd pick them up and then you would, in city court, get to the end of the 6 month period and they'd all be essentially ready for trial. And you would have what we would call stacked trials. So I would have like 4 misdemeanor trials set for trial on a given day. And we didn't know which ones were going to go. It just depended on which witnesses showed up for the prosecution and which
Wow.
cases they were ready for and which cases the defendant showed up and didn't bench for it. And so, and half the time your client just didn't communicate with you. And so you didn't know what was going to happen. So it was a trial by fire. I mean, it was a fantastic experience. And some of those trials that I did were some of the most memorable things that I've probably done in my life because you really went in there like on an adrenaline high. You didn't know what
Wow.
case was going to go, and then you tried that case. And it was a great experience, and I really
That's pretty
enjoyed it.
cool. Yeah, I mean, so are you literally like when you're doing that, are these bench trials or are you picking a jury and doing all that
No,
stuff?
jury trials. I mean, we did
Wow.
bench trials all the time and hearings constantly. I was in court. It felt like 24/7, but it was 8 to 12 hours a day, depending on where I was. And we always had hearings and bench trials going, but those were like stacked jury trials. So we had like 4 or 5 cases set for a jury trial, and you just didn't know which one you're going to do, and you pulled a jury and you ran with it.
So are you and you're making opening arguments, closing arguments? I mean, you're doing that literally 4 times. Like, how do
Well,
you?
only one of them went. The others didn't
Uh,
go because
mm,
it was, you had 4 that were going to go, but like a prosecution witness didn't show, a defendant bench warrants, and you have one case ready to go, and that's the one that goes. And if there were 2 ready to go, that second one gets put off to another day, is how
oh,
it
got it,
works.
got it. But you still got to be prepared for any of them. It's kind of interesting
Yeah.
because it's almost like it kind of reminds me when I was in law school at moot court, and it was like you showed up, you didn't know whether you were arguing for the plaintiff or the defendant or what you were.
Yeah.
So you kind of had to be prepared.
Yeah.
So you probably had to go in there with like 4 speeches prepared. That's interesting.
Sort of. It was
Sorta.
hard. I mean, you couldn't possibly, you didn't practice it like you did in moot court. Yeah, there's no way you could have 4 opening arguments ready to go when every single day was like that. There's no way you
Yeah.
could, I mean, it was arguably malpractice. There's no way any of these clients got the attention they deserved. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
they got what the paid for is what it really was. So
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You think about. Did you ever watch the show Better Call Saul?
yeah. Yeah.
Is it anything like what she did in that show? They both kind of took like she was interested, if I remember right, in sort of like pursuing like public defender type of work. I don't. That's the closest I've ever come to any sort of idea of what that must be like.
Yeah. Oh, I'm trying to remember. I watched that show, but I can't remember exactly what their lives look. They mostly just remember the Saul guy in his office all the time being
Yeah, I
kind of
remember
sketchy.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. They would take her in. And I just remember like she wanted to go into public defense. I watched it recently. So I know the show came out like 10 years ago, but my daughter was really into it. And so she got me into it. We watched it. And I remember taking her in and kind of like what you're saying. They took her back and they're like, okay, you want to work in this area? Here you go. And it's like this huge case room just with files and files and files of cases. And it's like, pick up 10 files and away you go.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what it was like. I know the public defender now, and I just had lunch with her, and she's a friend of mine from way back when we were both young public defenders. And she said there's a lot more training now, and the caseloads are smaller. It's not quite like it was back then, but
Yeah.
it was what it was. It was a great
Crazy.
experience. I don't regret it. I really enjoyed it, but I definitely got burnt out like most people do. It's just
People I've heard too, like kind of some of that stuff can be emotionally kind of taxing as well.
yeah,
And I know some friends of mine that have worked at the attorney general's office, like in the family court and deal with some of those things. And I know it can be pretty emotionally sort of taxing dealing with some of those issues.
it can be, but you realize when you're doing that job that some like the clients can be really challenging to deal with, and but then you realize when you're sitting next to them and they're getting their pre-sentence investigations read right before sentencing, the lives that they've had are just so the cards they've been dealt are just so unfortunate, and they've so many of them have had such horrible lives, and you realize sort of what made them into this sort of a shell of a person in a lot of ways, just because they didn't have love or support or stability or
Hmm.
opportunities, and it makes you
Yep.
appreciate the life you've got, and makes you feel like you're doing something good for them to the extent that you can.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We took, when I was at first started private practice, we had a volunteer lawyers practice where we would do intake. We didn't handle the cases, but we would do intake and we would sort of do like a little case brief and then kind of work with like hand it off to someone else. And it was difficult sometimes because people would walk in with all kinds of different personal situations and you want to help them, you want to help figure it out. But I mean, you just see like what a difficult, like almost like the cards are kind of stacked against them is so difficult. And now they're stuck in some legal proceeding for whatever reason. And it just compounds these problems. And it's just really heartbreaking to see kind of how these people kind of end up in those situations.
Yep, it is. It's unfortunate.
Okay. So you moved from the public defender's office, you ended up going into private practice, correct?
Yeah.
What did you end up doing there?
I was an associate with a civil litigation firm here in Rochester. They did plaintiffs and defense work for the plaintiffs work, like PI cases, and then defense work for insurance companies, and also the Wilmerite, which is a company locally that owns a lot of the malls. So we did a lot of defense work for them for all the litigation against the mall, not business litigation, but civil litigation, like flip
Mhm.
and solve and stuff. And then also there were some really preeminent criminal defense lawyers at that firm as well. So I still got to do a lot of the criminal defense work what I was used to doing. And so I did that for about 3.5 years. And then a couple of different things happened that resulted in me leaving. I also did employment discrimination for that firm, litigation, and some of the things that resulted in my leaving probably could have resulted in an employment discrimination claim. I just didn't bring one, but they occurred after I had my first daughter.
Mhm.
So I, at that point, decided that I would take a couple of years off and at least get the childbearing out of the way. So I took about 2.5 years off. And I also knew that that firm wasn't a good home for me, and that, and I, then I was going to try and figure out what I was going to do next after that. And so I had my second daughter. I left that firm in 2000 and middle of 2003, and I had her beginning of 2004. And then when she was about 6 months old, I kind of amped into where I am now.
Mm. So I'll go off topic just a little bit, but it's really tough, right? I mean, you kind of danced around it a little bit. I'm going to see if I can poke around on some of that a little bit, but I mean, it's really tough, right? I mean, when you're practicing law, especially when you're early in your practice, I mean, it's all about billing 2,000 hours when you're in private practice, and that's billable hours. And then on top of that, you need to do business development work and you got to do community service and all this sort of stuff. I mean, that you're selling your time, right? And that's difficult for someone that wants to have a family and traditionally for females, right? Who it's like most of the time moms are the ones staying at home, dads are the ones going to work. I've seen some friends of mine where that's the opposite, but it seems to be the exception. It's difficult, right? For a woman to sort of build a career early in her career and have a family at the same time. And how do you balance all that?
Well, I think that was definitely part of it. The biggest part for me was a colleague of mine who had been hired a couple months after me, but who and had significantly more experience than I did. Had practiced a lot longer than I had. He was promoted partner that year, and they told me that I would not be promoted that year. I'd be promoted the next year. And one of the partners told me, and I don't think I've spoken about this publicly. I don't think, and they're all good people, and none of those partners are even at that firm anymore. A lot of them are retired, but that I didn't get promoted because I took maternity leave, which
Yep.
was the quiet part said out loud. They weren't
Yep.
supposed to say that out loud. So
Yep.
that just to me was an indication that it wasn't the right place. And there was only one woman partner there out of a firm of 20 lawyers. And it was just an indicator to me that it wasn't the place that I wanted to spend the next part of my career. So
Yeah.
my husband was a nurse. And I don't think it had it really didn't have a lot to do with billable hours and my not carrying my weight because I came back and took on all the cases back that I'd had. And I was working 4 days a week instead of 5, and they were paying me less, even though I was carrying the exact same caseload.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what happens. It's that you end up missing out on the networking opportunities. I would eat lunch at my desk to get all my work done. I didn't have time to go out for drinks afterwards. So
Right.
that was the stuff I missed out on. It wasn't the workload and it wasn't the billable hours. It was all the things that are the glue that in any business, not just law,
Yeah.
that kind of get
Yeah.
you points and get you ahead.
And I feel like that they don't kind of teach you that in law school, but like really to give yourself leverage in private practice, you got to have your own book of business. And that requires you to go out and network and do all that business development like you're talking about. And so if you're constantly stuck in that repeated cycle of just doing work for other people, you tend to, I think people will feel like right or wrong, they'll sort of feel like you're expendable. We can find people that can do the work, what we're looking for, people that can bring in a book of business to make them a partner and things like that. And just like you say, I mean, like finding enough hours in the day to do all that and to build your own book and to create leverage for yourself is really difficult. It's difficult for anybody, let alone when you're having kids and trying to start a family at the same time. Yeah.
Well, and the hard part also was that even before I had kids, a lot of the work got done on the golf course. And when the women was there, when there was less women, especially back then, they couldn't all behave the way that they wanted to behave, for lack of a better, even when they're out having drinks. So you kind of were a damper on the party. And so I think that there were a lot of different ways where it was just harder and also books of business got handed down to guys from other guys in the firm. One of them was in a union. There was a union that one of the lawyers represented, and it was a union of a traditionally male field that did
Mm.
not, I guarantee you, want a women attorney. They wanted a
Yeah.
guy attorney to be handling it for him. So that's why this other attorney got that book of business, not because he was a better attorney at it, but
Right.
because the clientele were more comfortable. And that was also by a part not said out loud, but there were a lot of challenges. And so I found that when I went out on my own and I ended up in a place I never thought I'd be, but I found a lot more success when I didn't have other people kind of creating constraints around me based upon perceptions of how I was working and who I was. And I was a mother. And so therefore I wasn't as dedicated or whatever the case may be. And I ended up in a completely different place because I was able to create my own opportunities and,
Yeah.
and find these opportunities at a time when everything was changing and to kind of leverage them.
Yep. That's amazing that you took that leap. And so, I mean, was that kind of the impetus for it? And what led you to kind of the path that you ended up down? And so after private practice, I guess, kind of where did you go from there and what kind of led you to make that leap?
Well, I'd always enjoyed technology and looking back, it was a thread through my life. But, my dad brought home a TRS-80 computer I think I was like 12. I might have been a little younger than that. And I remember learning to program in BASIC to make it to play Pong because I wanted to play Pong.
Yeah. I
And
love
it didn't do
pongs.
anything unless you made it, you had to make it do it. And so I learned how to program like rudimentary basic programming language back then. And then in college, I took a Pascal programming class because it just interested me. And it was like the Pascal and programming for liberal arts majors. So it didn't have the crazy deadlines that the engineers had, but it was the exact same course. And then, so I was interested in that. And then in law school, I started watching Star Trek and I got really into like the next generation and this idea of technology being this great leveler and providing all this opportunity. And I always hoped that like maybe one day in my lifetime, some of this tech would be available because wouldn't that be cool? And then when I graduated from law school, I came back home and studied for the bar separate from my classmates because I knew they'd stress me out. So I came home and studied with SU law students rather than those people I went to school with.
Uh-huh.
And my mom was going to grad school at SU at the time. And so she had internet access in 95, which was pretty unusual back then.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I discovered the internet during the summer that I was studying for the bar. And I discovered like online chat rooms. I met my husband in an online chat room. My parents
No
used to
way.
yell at me and telling me that like,
Wow.
you're not going to pass the bar, get off the computer and start to sneak on it when they would leave the house. But so, and this is the guy I'm still married to and I have 2 kids with him. But so I met him online way back when. And I created a website then. That's when I learned to start programming in HTML. And I created a rudimentary website when there weren't a lot of websites back then. And then I went to law school, which was a black, or wait, I'm confusing. I graduated from law school and then I went to the public defenders, and the public defenders and that stage of my life was mostly kind of a black hole for tech, except that I was using eBay after I left the law firm to like sell my kids' clothes and to buy more kids' clothes because we were on just my husband's income at the time. And he was working overtime as a nurse. So when I started working at that, what I did at that point was I hung one thing I'm missing is when I was at the law firm before I left, I created a website for them. I convinced them that I told them, you need a website. This is where it's going. And so in 2002, they allowed me to use my billable time. I didn't get paid for it, but I got credit for it, sort of,
Yeah.
to build a website. I got Dreamweaver software and I built them a website.
Wow.
And right before I left, one of the partners said to one of the other partners in front of me, "Did you see the website Niki built for us?" This guy said, "No one's going to hire a lawyer on a website. That was a waste of time," like right in front of me.
That's
So
crazy.
another reason, kind
Yep.
of, that there are a lot of
Yep.
things that pointed me to leave. So I left, started dabbling in eBay, which is sort of how I got a look at the e-commerce, you know what I mean, and where that was going.
Yep.
And so then I decided to hang a shingle doing contract work for other lawyers on a part-time basis. So I created a website for myself. And I went and met my cousin for dinner, who was a lawyer in town, and or for lunch, to tell him my plans and to let him know that I'm going to do some contract work. And as they was walking away from the table afterwards, he said, "I heard about this thing called blogging on NPR. You might want to look that up." And so I'm like, "Blogging? What's that?" And so in 2005, this was 2005, I'd hung this virtual shingle and I started my blog, Generative, New York law blog. And at the time I was writing about Court of Appeals cases as they came down and appellate division cases so that I could help my potential clients, lawyers, see that I was up to date on the changes and knew what was happening and showcase my writing so that they could see that I could do writing. And so that's how I started to get, but then I started to do roundups of other New York bloggers. There were like 7 New York blogs at the time for lawyers. Like, and so I got to know all those lawyers online, and then I got to know other bloggers nationally. And I started writing for the local legal newspaper, the Daily Record. I wrote I wrote a free column, and then they offered to pay me to write a column for them about not tech at the time. But at the same time, I also started to talk to lawyers. And occasionally, in addition to writing about New York case law, I would write about, here's why you need to know what a blog is. There's this thing called social media. Here's why you need to know what social media is. And then I started increasingly writing about tech and the intersection of law and tech. And from that, I got to know all these lawyers nationally. I started to be able to go on bloggers passes to legal tech conferences, which means I didn't have to pay the admission fee, like the registration fee. And then I started getting asked to speak, but they wouldn't pay yet. So I would go and I'd get bloggers passes and speak and cover my own expenses. And then they started offering to cover my expenses. And by the time 2012 rolled around, Carolyn Elephant, who was for solo lawyers, and she's written books on that and has a blog, had asked me to co-author a book for the ABA on social media for lawyers. So that was published in 2010. And then I pitched to my editor at the time a cloud computing book for lawyers. So I wrote that on my own, and that was published by the ABA in 2012. And I also, during all this, was writing a Thomson Reuters Criminal Law New York book that I co-authored with a local judge who had asked me to join on and write that with her. So for a decade, I wrote that book. But so when my book came out in 2012, I went to one of the legal tech conferences and I met with some guys from the My Case team. I'd met with them before, and I knew the other CEOs of the other cloud companies because there weren't a lot of them back then for lawyers. But I met with the My Case guys, and because I was a journalist at that point, I was covering the industry. And they talked to me about a month later to show me a demo. And during that conversation, they offered to hire me. So I've been talking for a lot, so I'll take a break but that's when I started actually working for tech companies. And I can tell you about that as well. But
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I didn't want to stop you there because I mean, to me, it's almost like a trip down memory lane for myself as I'm thinking about some of the things you're talking and as those dates kind of happen. I remember my dad was a Xerox repairman, and so he worked on Xerox machines at the University of Kansas. He came home, so this was around 1995, and he came home and he's like, "Hey, you can get an email address at KU." I was a student at KU, and I was like, "Why would I want an email address? Like I
Right.
can I think I'm doing just fine, Dad. Like I can send somebody something in the mail. Like you ever heard of it? You don't need to email somebody." I mean, I'm like, he was like, "You might want to get on this." And then I remember talking to, similar to like how you met your husband, I met an attorney who was practicing in Philadelphia. I met him through Prodigy. There was like a chat room on Prodigy, and you could talk to people. And I just, it was like my mind was blown. I could talk to somebody who lived in Philadelphia, and he was communicating with me and stuff. It took me a little bit to catch on to some of these things. One of the things that I find very interesting is like you have this ability to kind of like see what's coming. I mean, for you to recognize, you had to be one of the first people ever to meet their spouse through online dating. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, the whole idea of that in the 90s. And then when you're talking about signing up for email and talking to your parents, and their parents are not wanting you to get on, like that like I remember all that. And I remember too, like you talk about like creating a website for your law firm. I remember when I first started practicing in 1998, like some attorneys didn't even have computers on their desk. They had like dictation machines, and they were like, "Why do I need a computer?" So, like, the idea of like going to someone now and saying you don't need a website for your law firm seems so foreign, but it wasn't back then. It's crazy. So you've had this sort of pattern in your career of really recognizing technology early. Like that's pretty impressive. As you deconstruct your career, I like any insight into how you develop that as a trait of yours. That's pretty good.
Well, that's just always something I think I've been interested in. And I've always been very good at patterns. Like it's interesting you said patterns, but at spotting patterns and seeing trends. And I mean, I think that that's why I've done so well with this path because I have I've been able to understand what is actually going to be a thing. Like I always thought Bitcoin and all that was just sort of stupid. I wrote one or two articles about it to help lawyers understand what it was, but I didn't think that was going to change the course of the practice of law or greatly impact the profession. And so, but I'm pretty good at spotting the things that are and knowing as soon as I see it that this is going to be like a game changer. I can't come up with those ideas. There are very unique people that are entrepreneurial that come up with those ideas. But as soon as someone comes up with an idea, I can be like, that's it. That's the
Yeah.
one that's going to change everything. So it's like a unique skill set. And a part of
But
it's because I have a passion for tech, and part of it's because I have a passion for possibilities on the potential of tech, and also because I understand the practice of law, like a decade practice on.
real quick, I want to recognize our sponsor, Array. Array handles all of the details of litigation so that you can focus on winning your case. They take care of forensic collection, e-discovery, managed review, record retrieval, court reporting, legal staffing and recruiting, trial support, you name it. I'm the general counsel at Array, so I may be a little bit biased, but I was also a client before I started working there too. I've used them on various matters, and they've always delivered. If you're involved in a lawsuit, make Array your first call, and they'll help you get organized right from the beginning. You can reach out to me or visit trustarray.com. Now, back to the pod. I don't think you always need to be the one that comes up with those ideas, but I think recognizing those ideas and jumping on board early, to me, it's a combination of sort of like be. I'm going to be a little psychologist here, but it's a being an optimist. It's someone that's optimistic about the future and how technology can help benefit it, and somebody who's open minded enough to try new things. Like I think you need that combination in order to be willing. Because to me, like so often, the safe thing to say is that's stupid, that's dumb. Like I don't get like so. But people that are willing to tinker with stuff, like for you to teach yourself how to code at such a young age, or to jump onto eBay and sell things. I remember I was talking with somebody about this the other day. They were like, the internet is just an information tool. Nobody's ever gonna put their credit card on the internet. Nobody's ever going to buy anything on the internet. It's just going to be an information tool. And so being willing to kind of be one of those early adopters, you can put yourself, you can be at significant risk of somebody pointing their finger at you later and saying, see, I told you that was stupid. But I'm always like, I don't know, I guess I'm comfortable enough to be have people point their finger at me and say I'm stupid. I'm like, I love crypto. I think it's pretty interesting and I'm pretty fascinated by it. And I jumped in a few years ago and started trying to figure it out. I wish I had gotten in 2012. But I think that, I mean, do you feel like you're that kind of person that's sort of willing to just tinker and jump in the middle and just try to figure things out, even
Well,
at
I've
the
always
risk
had
of,
yeah,
yeah,
I've always had a curiosity about things, and I always want to figure out the answers to things. But I also think I'm more of a realist. If you ask my husband, he'd probably say I was a pessimist. So I think it's interesting that
interesting. Yeah.
I think maybe I'm an optimist about certain things, like the potential of technology. Like I definitely, and I think crypto's definitely interesting, just in terms of its intersection with the practice of law. And I have never really seen a lot of implications. Not that it, in and of itself, is not a really interesting idea and has a lot of potential. And but it just didn't seem to me that it was going to change the way lawyers operated in any way. So that's
Mhm.
for me, it's a very unique intersection. That's why I say I'm like at the intersection of law and tech. But for me, I just really enjoy like science fiction is always, I love the potential of science fiction. I love the idea of this future where, humanity's united and where everything's egalitarian and it's not men and women, it's people and it's humanity against the aliens rather than all this division. So I think that in some way that there is a lot of optimism, but also a lot of realism. Like AI and generative AI right now is kind of terrifying and it's hard to tell where we're going to go with it. But the
Mm.
potential is the potential for good is enormous, just
Mhm.
as the potential for things going sideways is equally enormous and terrifying.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and that intersection of law and technology is a really interesting one too, because legal industry is very slow to change. I mean, and so, yeah, I mean, do you see, I see some lawyers, traditional lawyers, which tend to like, because of the hierarchy of how kind of some of the things we talked about earlier, I mean, how you sort of develop in your career, they're just not willing to embrace it. Or if they see what's coming, rather than embracing it, they're fighting it. I mean, do you think are we as lawyers, as a legal industry, like intentionally sort of suppressing the adoption of technology for our own self interest, i.e., the billable hour? Or do you think that no, people are more open minded today? They're more willing to embrace technology than before.
well, historically, and for most of my career, lawyers have been very tech resistant. The people at the tops of the firms in particular have been, but the technology is such a rising tide and it was moving really quickly before the pandemic that it was kind of like they couldn't resist. So they would eventually start using the cloud. They would eventually start using social. But what happened with the pandemic and what has been so interesting is that it forced them to use technology and it primed them to be more receptive to technology than they otherwise ever would have been, I think. So what happened on the other side of the pandemic is that it's almost like we were perfectly queued up for generative AI to show up on the scene because lawyers now understand the benefits of remote work, especially for themselves versus the people that work for them. Like lawyers at the top are happy to work remotely when it suits them. They just don't want people below them working remotely when they want them around them. It's sort of, or they want to boss them around and stuff. But
Uh-huh.
so they understand that. They understand the value of Zoom. They understand the value of the cloud in ways that they never did before. And so the thing that's been super interesting about generative AI is it is just exponentially increasing. It has exponential and very easily identifiable benefits that other were much more easy to sell and explain than the other types of tech. And what I'm seeing in other people that do what I do or that talk to lawyers at conferences about these things, give presentations on generative AI and write about it is that I've never seen such curiosity to at least understand it and learn what it is, depending on their practice areas. Sometimes they're terrified about its potential, and other times they're really excited. I spoke to a group of elder law attorneys, and they're mostly a document creation practice. Like that's what
Mm.
they do. They give advice, but they also create these documents as part of that. And they all just were terrified overall, the whole group. It was like an annual meeting for a national or no, a state group.
Hmm.
And they were terrified, kept coming up after they kept
Yep.
coming to me with a presentation I tend to give across the board. But then I just spoke at a trial lawyers. I keynoted at a trial lawyers thing last week. And they had a very different, they're much a different perception. Like some of them were a little bit, a few of them were like about close to retirement. They're like, this is really interesting, but I'm glad I'm retiring, which is
Hmm.
another thing that comes up a lot. But they were much more interested because you can't replace a lot of litigation functions. You can streamline them, but you can't replace going to court. You can't replace the conversation with clients. You're just not going to be able to. Just like you can't replace nurses right now or hands-on doctors versus like
Mhm.
radiologists and surgeons are easier to, at least are going to be more impacted by AI. But so
Yep.
it's definitely a generative AI, and this post-pandemic period is definitely a different type of the lawyers are approaching tech differently. And it's exciting for someone that's in my position
Mhm.
that wants to help them connect with tech. But it can be terrifying for the lawyers that have always been resistant because they're even further behind than their colleagues who've sort of tried to keep up with it. So, and
Yeah.
it's exponentially advancing right now. It's kind of terrifying how fast things are moving.
Yeah, it seems that way to me too. I'm going to the Clock conference next week in Vegas, and so for legal ops people, and in my mind, kind of what I see is it seems to me like more the in-house departments are embracing legal technology. They're pushing that envelope. They're forcing their outside counsel to learn about this stuff, to be more efficient. Like the whole concept of a legal operations team and a person to me is a relatively new concept. I don't I couldn't tell you when that first kind of came on the scene, but as someone who's been a general counsel for the last 20 years, I didn't have a legal ops person. I had paralegals that would help in different capacities, and they would kind of bring tech, and in more recent years, bringing more ideas in terms of how we could monitor legal billing and deal with contracts and deal with EC compliance and some of those things. But it wasn't as defined, at least it from my perception, until more recently. And now you're seeing these industry conferences like Clock and stuff like that, where it's almost like imperative that if you're an in-house legal department of any size at all, really having a legal operations expert that understands technology and understands what's coming along and figuring out how to plug that stuff in. They're driving a lot of this innovation to me in the legal industry, and they're forcing these law firms to sort of figure it out. Because if you can't do it, we're going to go with this other group. I don't know. Does that resonate, or do you see that from your perspective?
Well, yeah. And I think that like I just spoke to a group of trial attorneys and they were defense. So their clients are insurance companies. You're seeing the exact same thing you're going to, what I told them. See the exact same thing as you're seeing, which is that when an entity, in this case, in-house counsel is hiring outside counsel. I always like to call them outhouse counsel. That's not correct. They're outside counsel.
Yeah.
And I always, for some reason, want to default to that, but they're outside counsel.
Yep.
But it's the same thing when like an enterprise, an entity, a commercial or a business entity is hiring lawyers. That's where I think you're going to see it the most. I think it may upend the billable hour. I strongly think there's a high potential for that. Some of my legal tech colleagues disagree. They think everyone's been saying that forever, but I think this is what's really going to do it, because when you have these either in-house lawyers or insurance companies or other types, in-house lawyers at all these businesses,
Mhm.
when they put pressure on law firms that are outside counsel, what's going to happen is because you have such intelligent and informed and astute legal consumers, either the in-house team or else the insurance company or that type of thing. When you have them, and they're so smart, and they know the value that AI can provide is they know that you're not going to bill me 0.75 for reading a letter or drafting a letter. That's ridiculous. But you could bill me point 0.3 at this point, have a draft of the letter, most of it, and then you edit it in point 0.3 and make it so that it actually includes the specific things that the AI missed, right? So it's going to get to a point where these entities are going to be putting pressure on law firms, and the consumer is going to make the choice. They're going to say, if you can't do it, we're going to go to someone else who's going to give us use these tools and give us a much more fair price, or even move to flat fee billing, right? And this is
Mhm.
the other thing that's so interesting to me. When you have a law firm that has a law practice management software or billing software or matter management software, or whatever the larger law firms are going to use, that they will have sole siloed functions with software for each function. But once you have all of the law firm's data in one place, and you can take an AI tool that can crunch and analyze all the law firm's data and serve as almost like a Q&A or an assistant that can analyze that data for you. You can say, when was the last time we had a case like this? How long did it last? What was our billable hour? What was our profit? This is what this case is going to look like. Can you predict how long it's going to last? Can you predict what a reasonable flat fee would be that would still allow us to make a profit on this case using the tools that we already have in place? And when you
Yep.
have that capability, not only does the AI allow lawyers to be more efficient, it allows them to accurately price a case and charge flat fees so that they can then compete more effectively in the market and undercut larger firms that aren't doing that.
Yep.
Then you know that inside counsel and insurance companies and any other enterprise entity like that is going to choose the firm that's going to give them a predictable rate. when it's going to make it easier for them to predict their legal fees for the year or the quarter or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I think definitely that's the case. I mean, whenever I'm in the boardroom, right, it's always like the board members are always saying the same thing, right? No surprises. We don't want any surprises. Like,
Mm.
and that constant fear that I would always have of what kind of bill am I going to get? Like, you're kind of like afraid to open what the bill's going to be because you just sort of go along, you're doing whatever it is. That predictability and understanding, like, hey, a case like this should only cost this, or this kind of transaction should only cost this. And like you said, now law firms have that data and they can analyze it. One of the cool tools that we talk about is in deposition work, especially with like insurance companies, that you can there's fewer and fewer court reporters and more people are starting to adopt technology as a way to conduct their depositions. And you can sort of track if you're doing like thousands and thousands of depositions and you're handling the same type of case, you can kind of predict with a certain level of certainty kind of what the value of that case is going to be based on a few questions early. And so how can like insurance companies, as they're sort of processing claims and they're going through just thousands of litigation matters every year, use technology to sort of find commonality amongst some of these answers to predict the value of a case and reach a settlement much earlier, versus the cost of going, through the full litigation proceeding. And I think what are other ways that people can leverage this technology to be way, way more efficient? And it may not necessarily be in the law firm's best interest, but corporations, the consumers of legal services are getting smarter and smarter about how this stuff all works, and they're insisting on it. And so, to my way of thinking, it's like you can either adopt it, like you can kind of take your approach, like early in your life, where you sort of figured this stuff out and you got to the bottom of it now, or you can be brought in kicking and screaming down the road. But it seems to me that it's coming like this intersection of tech and law is coming like a freight train. And people would be well served, inside counsel and outhouse counsel, to figure it out early. Like, get on board, read Nikki's stuff and pay attention to this stuff. I think it's where we're all headed.
Well, and I've been writing about AI since 2017 for the ABA Journal. Like every month, I cover a specific type of software, and I'll write about what is the software, what does it do, what kind of lawyers will want to use it. Here are the things to think about when you're choosing and vetting a provider. And then here are some of the top products and the top brands or types of providers in the industry for this type of software and price points if it's available. And so I've been writing about AI generally since 2017. Like I've been covering it for a long time. And then I've been trying to cover the generative AI tools fairly regularly now. And like the most recent one I wrote was actually for in-house counsel. And I think it's only the second time I've done that because I typically focus more on solo and small firm market. But that is one of I focus on matter management for in-house counsel with AI and included AI functionality where it was available. But it's, you're definitely going to see AI impacting all aspects from intake to matter management to contract lifecycle management and contract drafting, analysis, and revision, right? Like it's going to touch all of those different things.
Mhm.
So significantly for in-house counsel. And then like we're talking about the pressures that are going to be put on because there's such a sophisticated consumer of legal services when they ask outside counsel to do work, you're going to find that there are significant billing pressures put on them. And I think that it's just generative AI is not only going to, like I said, make the work more efficient, but it's also going to allow law firms and in-house counsel and other legal consumers to more accurately predict what it should cost
Mhm.
and to make those demands and allow firms to figure that out accurately as well. Because firms shouldn't, they have to be able to operate a profit. I mean, it's a business,
Yep.
but it's always,
Absolutely.
especially with litigation, traditionally been really difficult to determine what actually is going to happen. You don't know if opposing counsel is going to bring a summary judgment motion or multiple motions or how long it's going to take sometimes, or like sometimes cases just take a turn and they become inordinately more complex than you thought they were going to be at the
Yep.
start of litigation. So those are sometimes some of the challenges for sure. But
Yeah, and I think like if I see sort of like anyone that's going to be disrupted, it seems to me that it's kind of like what we talked about earlier. It's like the people with the book of business, the people with the relationships and the network, they're going to be fine. They're going to have a book of business that they can continue to bring in. The harder thing to me is going to be figuring out your place in the world when you're a young attorney, because AI can replace what junior attorneys would always, you'd be sort of stuck. Like for me, like as a corporate lawyer, would be stuck preparing schedules and sifting through thousands of contracts in a big M&A deal, and you're trying to look for do you need a consent to assignment, and you're scheduling all these things. And you could, I mean, you upload all that data, you sift through it using AI, and you crank out schedules that first and second year students or lawyers might have been doing before. So finding that intersection of law and tech where you can be valuable early in your career and bring some of that new tech and understand how to operate it, to me, is where some of these younger associates are going to need to sort of show their value. And it could be the hard, if anybody's going to be disrupted, I feel like it's kind of those junior attorneys. You may need
But
fewer of them.
I think you're right. I think the two biggest impacts, in my opinion, are going to be the disrupting the billable hour, and then it's also going to be disrupting what I would call training of lawyers, right? Because
Yeah.
right now the law firms essentially train lawyers. The law schools don't. Law schools do very little to prepare lawyers to practice law or to run their own firms either. Like they don't. They do very little or to understand technology. They're still doing the traditional model of training them on how to think like a lawyer. But the reality is that I think it's going to be entry level associates and also a lot of admins because that are going to be impacted because first of all, historically, whenever they do layoffs, it's admins and then young associates, right? That's who they always lay off whenever the
Yeah.
firms do this. But also one of the things that I do for my case in LawPay, that company I work for our legal brands, is I oversee and write four different reports. Three of them are benchmark reports where we pull data from our software, anonymized data, and provide all sorts of benchmark data to help lawyers run their firms. But then the fourth one that I do every year is survey based. And this year I surveyed, last August, 2,600 lawyers and legal professionals. And the first part of it I focused on was AI, because that was clearly what was the biggest trend happening. And one of the things that we asked was impact. Did they know what AI was? How did they think it was going to impact their practice? Were they using it? And whether they thought that it was going to replace certain types of job functions, and if so, which ones? And I wasn't the first one to ask this question. Other surveys have had a similar question asked. And it's admins and young associates, never the partners. They're not going to replace themselves, but they're going to replace everyone below them. And so
Yep.
I think that what it's going to force law schools to have to do is have a lot more clinical, almost like a residency. So there's going to be a dramatic shift in the services that law schools provide to the industry and to their students. And you may see like residencies or apprenticeships or something like what you see in med schools, because the law firms are not going to have those entry level positions, and neither are in-house counsel. You're not going to have these entry level positions, and not everyone's going to go out and go solo. They're not going to be able to afford it. They're going to have all these loans. So they're going to have to find ways to train them so that they can enter lateral in, for lack of a better word. It won't be lateraling. It'll be joining at 4 or 5 years experience, because there won't be any 1 or 2 year experience positions left, because the
Yeah.
AI will be doing it all.
Yeah. And I feel like there's still some value. I mean, not some, and there's still a lot of value in outside counsel and kind of the advice that they bring, the experience that they bring to bear, you know, enhancing their advice using technology, using AI, I think is important. I wonder whether the kind of on a topic that you brought up earlier with the billable hour, if we're going to see more transaction based billing, I just, like you said, people have sort of been talking about the death of the billable hour for a long time now, but it just seems like we're kind of at that point where it makes sense to me. These alternative billing structures make sense, especially if you're leveraging technology and people kind of go, okay, I'm willing to pay $500,000 for this transaction. We're doing $1 billion acquisition, and we've got to make sure we've got experienced people advising us along the way. And the expertise that they bring has value, even if you can't sort of add it all up on a 0.7, 0.8, 1.2. There was a big firm last year. I can't remember that the name of the firm. So I don't want to guess at the name of the firm, but it got a lot of publicity for their block billing when they represented Twitter in the bid that Elon Musk had. And they were taking tons of heat because in that lawsuit that Elon, I think, wasn't paying the bill. Once he took over Twitter, he refused to pay the bill. And so they got into a lawsuit over whether or not the bill was going to be payable. And people would see these block billing of 12 hours, 16 hours or whatever. And it was like this manufactured bill to fit what they all believed the appropriate sort of, expense should have been for that law firm representing him in that case or in that acquisition. And so, like, dispense with the fiction of it, with the like creating a bill,
Hmm.
if you're going to bill $1 billion to Twitter for representing them on that deal, don't make it up by
Right.
the billable, or just call it what it is and send them a bill for $1 billion. Like, why is there not more of that on the front end?
Well,
I
and it's
think what
really
you'll see,
hard. Yeah. I think it's really hard to be a legal consumer because I had to use a mid-sized regional firm for something recently, and a pretty formed document came in that took me point two to read it. Like I read it and I don't even practice in that area, but it took me point two. When I got the
Mhm.
bill, it was like, took the lawyer point five. It took another lawyer point five. It took a paralegal point three. And I told her, I'm like, I'm not paying this. What are you talking about? It took me
Yeah,
point two. And
yeah,
there's no way all these people spend this much time reading this form document that you guys see every single day. That's
right.
BS. Like I got really mad at him and he
Mhm,
reduced my bill. And but it was like that type of thing happens all the time. And what you're discussing is like on a much grander scale, but it's
mhm,
offensive, especially when you're a more informed consumer and you know that it's ridiculous.
mhm.
Oh, and that
Yeah,
happens
you
all the
get.
time. And
I get
yeah,
frustrated by it too. The thing that frustrates me is when you staff up a deal and then you get the bill and you've got a project assistant, you got a
yeah,
paralegal, you got two junior associates, and then you got the quote unquote partner. Like, so then the partner's got to basically then oversee the work before it goes out the door, right? And it's like, wait a second. So, like you said, you wrote a letter and it took 3.2 hours to write the letter because it took six people to write it. Like it's
right. And everyone has to review it because you got so many like cooks in the kitchen or whatever the expression is. Like, come on.
yeah, and I think they're looking at it another way. It's kind of like, hey, there's value in some of the services that they provide. I think when you get up like small little matters like that, or maybe one thing, but like the bigger transactional work where, hey, you know what, we want to hire Sidley or we want to hire Skadden Arps to sort of handle this case, and we can kind of say, hey, there's comfort in the boardroom of knowing that we've got experienced people that are going to be representing us on this deal, and we're willing to pay X amount of dollars for it. I just think like anymore, especially like you want your attorneys leveraging technology. I don't want them sort of focusing on the fictitious sort of billable hour. Like, let's all just agree up front what it's going to be, and like you said, there's predictability in what that cost is going to be, and let's figure that out up front and get busy doing the substantive work versus trying to pad the bill or doing any or train younger associates on my nickel and that kind of stuff. One of the things I was going to talk about real quick, I know we're kind of running out of time, but I wanted to touch on this because you wrote about it recently, but it's this concept of deep fakes. So can you just sort of explain real quick what that is and kind of what you're seeing in the industry?
Well, it's really interesting. It's the idea that because of generative AI, it was possible before generative AI came onto the scene, but generative AI makes it even easier to fake image, video, text. So essentially, people can manufacture evidence or enhance or alter, pre-existing video or whatever the case may be. And so what's happening is the courts are really grappling with this. Since in my above the law post that came out like 2 weeks ago, I wrote about some of the efforts that are underway where in terms of modifying rules of evidence or in terms of dealing or court ruled about this type of thing. So there was a one case that sort of caught my eye and made me think about all of this was where a judge precluded the introduction of a video that had been enhanced by AI because it was not the original video. And then from that, I saw that New York had handed down its AI report. The task force on AI handed down the report, which included the ethical issues. It was a 91-page report, but it also talked about the deep fakes, and they talked about some efforts that were underway that I included in my blog post, both at the federal level, where somebody was petitioning to have the federal rules of evidence amended to address the not authorizing,
Oh, the
authenticating
auction. Yeah.
evidence. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
authenticating evidence. And then there were also efforts in New York, which is where I reside, to update and revise the CPLR, the Civil Procedure Law and Rules, to also incorporate something similar about evidence authentication. And after that was published, my post was published, someone from one of the people that was petitioning at the federal level emailed me and told me that the day after my post was published, she listened in on there must have been a hearing or something. And then the audio was published, and it sounded like they were not going to accept, or they turned down or denied that application. And so her and her partner, whoever she was working with, were going to go back and revise their submission and see if to address some of the issues that they'd come up with about why they didn't want to adopt their suggestion and amend the federal rules of evidence. But so it's interesting just to see. And then meanwhile, you've got all the different courts grappling with court rules for the use of AI. There's like
Mhm.
48 courts and orders and guides that have and counting that have been handed down across the country to deal with the use of AI, both in the creation of pleadings, but also evidence and trying to ensure the safety of our system of justice by
Yep.
precluding evidence that is not based in reality.
Accurate. Yeah,
Really.
it's fictitious
Yeah.
evidence that people are presenting. I mean, it's unbelievable when you look at some of this stuff and you're like, you'd swear that's Mark Zuckerberg talking, right? You got his voice. I mean, and so I've heard it in the context too of like an opportunity, like a business opportunity for people that are out there, for celebrities that don't want to have their voice or their image used inappropriately to
Mhm.
promote products or to promote political views or to promote things. And so ways of identifying those fictitious, those deep fakes, and then how do they address those and get them taken down, or how do you authenticate that stuff? I've heard it suggested like combining some of this with crypto and using the blockchain to validate whether or not something is actually accurate, and using like, so LeBron James has a way of sort of like, it's on the blockchain, you can see that he approved it, that's a valid sort of use of his
Huh.
name, image, and likeness. Is there a way to marry that technology up? And then are there ways for lawyers to identify deep fakes and then take action against them? It seems to me like a serious problem. And the idea that you can manufacture evidence to support your case, or that using deep fake, and even going back to what you were talking about, like with the public defender's office. I mean, some of these people in the system of justice, how do you combat something? If somebody accuses you of something and they create a fictitious sort of deep fake thing, and how do yeah, it's a tough issue to try to figure out. It's complicated stuff. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out, because it can be very, very tricky to figure out what's real and what's not.
Yeah. And there aren't a lot of AI experts, like generative AI. That's one of the challenges with it is it's so new that there are not a lot of people that can be considered experts in this technology. Everybody's catching up. There were 100 companies that were working with OpenAI before the release of ChatGPT 3.5 in like November, was it November of 2022?
Hmm.
2023,
Yeah.
2023, 2022,
When it came
2022.
out,
Yeah, it was
2022. Yeah.
November. Yeah,
Hmm.
2022. Co-Counsel was one of them, one of like those 100 companies. They were the only legal tech company. But so I would argue that the people that are part of the Case Text Co-Counsel that got acquired by Thomson Reuters are some of the actual few experts in the space, but anywhere, not just in the legal tech space. But everyone's been playing catch up, but it's the biggest talent is going to the largest companies. And so, um, and like places like the public defenders, forget about generative AI experts. It's hard for them to have experts in digital evidence alone. Like there's a lawyer that I know locally who was a public defender, and then he took over. That became his role, like before AI or before Gen AI. But his role became managing all the digital evidence that came in and helping the lawyers navigate that. And now I think he's at the Attorney General or the U.S. Attorneys. I can't remember which, but someone else. It's hard for them to find anyone to take on that role because it's a tricky role. And especially with generative AI, it just makes it even harder for them to even present a defense based on those. So they can't necessarily afford to hire experts for that to refute
Yeah.
the
Yeah. For
validity of
just,
the evidence.
yeah. I mean, you can think about like access to justice and people that can manipulate things to their advantage. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be a tricky issue for a lot of people to deal with in terms of whether or not what you're looking at, if you see a video of something, you hear audio of something, and really understanding, is that real or is it not real? Someone presenting evidence that this is a conversation that I had with this person, it could sound exact. I mean, there's audio and video with as much as people share on social media. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's plenty of data to work with to manipulate
Yeah.
somebody's image or or
To just
voice.
create a voice print. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's really interesting. I think that's a fascinating issue that I'm looking forward to seeing you continue to explore. So, well, I think we're about out of time. I don't want to keep you too long. I really appreciate you coming in and talking about some of this stuff. We got to maybe, I don't know, half of what I wanted to talk to you about. So maybe you can come back and we can explore some of this more.
Yeah. A lot of fun.
No, well, thank you. It was fun. I appreciated the conversation. So Niki Black, please follow her. She's got incredible content, again, at the intersection of law and tech. And I want to thank her for coming on the show. And I want to thank Array for sponsoring the program and making this all possible. Please tune into the Attorney Lounge on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Again, Niki, thank you very much for coming in.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking me.